There's also a famous hadith in Sahih Bukhari which mentions that the cure will be in three things: in cupping, honey, and cauterization. However, I forbid my nation to do cauterization. My suggestion in terms of finding good quality honey is to try to look for raw, unfiltered, ideally organic as well, and ideally from smaller local bee farmers where you can actually go and see the supply and their operation to verify for yourself. That's probably the best way. The fact that honey is very strongly antimicrobial. And what I mean by that is it's antibacterial, it's antifungal, it's even antiviral. There are published studies on this as well. There are a number of different adulterated forms of it. This is very unfortunate, but keep in mind that even many of the bee farmers will tell you sometimes they end up feeding bees a certain type of sugar solution. There's also something called pollen patties, which sometimes bee farmers feed the bees. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be unto you. Today I'm really excited to be able to speak to you again about one of the great super sunnah foods. This is part of my series regarding some of the greatest sunnah foods. We'll be presenting some of their benefits to you over these next few videos. Today's particular food, brothers and sisters, relates to something that's been used for literally over hundreds and thousands of years. It's been used medicinally for at least the last 8,000 years. There's record of human use for medicinal purposes for it going back 8,000 years. Imagine that. And yet, at the same time, many people, when they think about this particular food, they have kind of a limited scope of it, and they think it's used for certain things, but they may not be aware that it has a lot of benefits that go beyond the common perception. What am I speaking about? I'm speaking about honey. Honey, many people think is just a nice, natural, kind of more healthy sweetener. Some people have the idea that it's just used for sore throat or when somebody has a cough, and those are certainly true facts. But honestly, the benefits of honey go way beyond that, and we're going to shed some light on that in this particular video. We're going to be explaining it from a brief Islamic standpoint, but we're also going to be presenting some of its greatest benefits based on modern science, as well as, more importantly, practical tips on how to use it and even address some of the common questions or misconceptions people have about honey. So let's get right into it. From an Islamic standpoint, we have to start with the Quranic verse where Allah, the most exalted, the most wise, the most knowledgeable, says the following about honey. يخرج من بطونها شراب مختلف ألوانه فيه شفاء للناس إن في ذلك لآية لقوم يتفكرون. Subhanallah, your Lord inspired to choose your dwelling in the hills, in the trees, and in what man built. From within their bodies comes a liquor of different colors, wherein is a healing for humanity. There is another famous couple of hadith that I wanted to share also of the Prophet ﷺ. One of them says, if you seek a remedy, then it is in honey and in the Quran. This is referring to the fact that honey and the Quran are mentioned in the Quran itself as a form of shifa. And so the Prophet ﷺ is also recalling this in this particular hadith. There's also a famous hadith in Sahih Bukhari which mentions that the cure will be in three things: in cupping, honey, and cauterization. However, I forbid my nation to do cauterization. أو كما قال صلى الله عليه وسلم. So again, it's very important to note that Allah, the most exalted, most knowledgeable in the universe, has said and highly recommended honey for its healing properties. In terms of modern uses and modern research, modern studies, to give you just a quick glimpse, in the public medical database that's the largest in the world, that's free, it's called PubMed. If you search honey and its benefits, you'll see more than a few thousand studies on this particular subject. So subhanAllah, and these are of course mostly from non-Muslims, so it's a very big subject, but I'll try to just provide a summary of some of the benefits. First of all, our viewers should know that honey is full of certain vitamins, minerals, enzymes, antioxidants. In particular, honey has some quantity of vitamin A, B, C, E. It also has certain minerals like calcium, magnesium, potassium, phosphorus, zinc, as well as, like I said, some of the very useful enzymes and antioxidants. If you look at a summary of some of the chief benefits, the first one I want you guys to know, which is one of the most important, relates to the fact that honey is very strongly antimicrobial. And what I mean by that is it's antibacterial, it's antifungal, It's even antiviral. There are published studies on this as well. So just to give you a couple examples, some of our viewers may have heard of Manuka honey. Manuka honey is honey that comes from New Zealand, and they've done published studies, again, by some of the professors in New Zealand, that say it is very strongly antibacterial, even stronger than some antibiotics. Believe it or not, they've even used it in lab studies against what's known as MRSA. MRSA stands for methicillin-resistant Staph aureus bacteria. Some of our viewers may know that MRSA is a very stubborn infection that even hospitals have a very difficult time treating. Antibiotics don't work on it very well. But Manuka honey has been found to be effective in lab studies even with respect to that. Think about it also. Have you ever seen rotten honey? Theoretically, honey can rot, if it's stored in very bad conditions. But in general, it's very difficult for any type of microorganism to grow in honey because of its very strongly antimicrobial properties. Another huge benefit of honey that everybody should be aware of and may have heard about is with respect to respiratory problems. So people often use it for cough, for sore throat, even for asthma and allergies. There are again published studies, and I'll attach all the references below the video, where honey is being used for cough. It's actually more effective than over-the-counter cough suppressants like Robitussin. So keep that in mind as well. I've had many patients use it for asthma, especially when combined with other sunnah remedies like black seed oil or ginger or garlic. Honey can be very effective for asthma. In my particular practice, we also have patients use it for allergies. By itself, it's not always enough to treat allergies, but keep in mind that honey does have some pollen in it, as well as the enzymes and antioxidants and nutrients that are in it that are beneficial for allergies. So again, this is one of its areas of benefits. Similarly, with respect to the skin, again, hundreds of studies on the benefits of honey for the skin, meaning for cuts, wounds, ulcerations, burns. Part of the reason it's so beneficial for that is partly because of its antibacterial properties, but also because, keep in mind, honey helps to heal tissue and helps them to regenerate. Another series of benefits is with respect to eye disorders or eye conditions. Some of you may have heard of conjunctivitis or pink eye. Some of you may have heard of blepharitis, another type of infection. In a few minutes, I'm going to be explaining to you how you can use what's known as a honey eye wash to help with these particular conditions. There are a number of different studies on honey's benefits with respect to digestive disorders. That includes even things like stomach ulcers, even gastritis, even H. pylori. Some people use it for abdominal pain as well as diarrhea. There is the famous hadith of the Prophet ﷺ where a companion came to him complaining of severe abdominal pain. He told him to take honey 3 times. He wasn't cured. On the 4th time, he took it, and by the will of Allah, this companion was cured. So again, the Prophet ﷺ also mentioned it with respect to digestive disorders. There's another area of benefits of honey, which again, some of our viewers may not be as familiar with, but there are actually published studies in medical journals that honey is beneficial even for lowering your blood pressure. Who would have thought of that? But the studies are there. It can even help lower LDL cholesterol. It can help lower triglyceride in some cases. It is beneficial even for blood clots. Even with respect to cancer, there are actually published studies that honey has certain anti-cancerous properties, especially in lab studies. So again, these are things that people don't commonly think of, but again, honey is beneficial even for those. So obviously, if you have any of these conditions and you would like to utilize honey, then disclaimer alert, right? You should be checking with your doctor or physician before doing so. So let's get right into the more practical aspect, which relates to how to use honey in a practical sense. So with respect to the use of honey, the first thing I want our viewers to be aware of is that there are a number of different adulterated forms of it, and this is very unfortunate, but keep in mind that even many of the bee farmers will tell you sometimes they end up feeding bees a certain type of sugar solution. There's also something called pollen patties, which sometimes bee farmers feed the bees, and this is especially used in times when there's a shortage of honey and pollen. You might know that bees typically pollinate flowers between spring and fall, and even though they can in winter as well, it tends to be much less then, and so they typically have to rely on storage or stored forms of pollen and honey at those times. So some of the bee farmers end up compensating because of high demand or whatever, that they end up ending up feeding bees a sugar solution. So again, the quality of that is not going to be the same. There's no really easy way to get around that, but my suggestion in terms of finding good quality honey is to try to look for raw, unfiltered, ideally organic as well, and ideally from smaller local bee farmers where you can actually go and see the supply and their operation to verify for yourself. That's probably the best way. Even with respect to organic, there are some issues with verifying whether honey is truly organic or not. But if you can get honey that's certified organic, it could theoretically be better in some respects. With respect to dosage, typically people are taking anywhere from a teaspoon to even 3 tablespoons per day. Obviously, if somebody has more serious illness like a digestive disorder or an infection, they can take higher doses and then divide it across the day. With respect to specific applications, we'll give a few examples. If somebody has a sore throat or cough, it's better to take honey in the straight form, let it go down the throat and flow down it without diluting it. If you have sore throat, you could in certain cases also dilute honey in some warm water and do a gargle with it. Some people gargle with honey, some people gargle obviously with salt, but that is another beneficial technique. With respect to skin conditions, honey can be applied directly onto the wound. It will accelerate healing. It's also antibacterial. Some people use honey on the face, like as face wash or as a face mask. It can be utilized in that way as well. I mentioned earlier about eye infections like pink eye, for example. How do you use honey for that? Well, what you can do is take 5 teaspoons of honey and put it in like a cup of boiling water. Once you make that sugar solution, you can actually dab your eyes with this particular honey solution. You can do it multiple times a day. The heat in this case does not necessarily destroy its antibacterial properties, so it is actually beneficial. I myself have used this technique. I've had patients do it. So again, this is another thing called a honey eye wash. Similarly, you might know that honey can be used instead of sugar as a sweetener. It's obviously much healthier. In this next section, I'll address some of the questions that people often have with respect to using it in these particular purposes. So let me get right into that. First of all, some people will ask the question, they'll say, well, what about crystallized form of honey? They think if it's crystallized that it's gone bad. That is actually usually not true. A lot of it depends on the storage temperature. So if honey is stored in very cold temperatures, it'll start to crystallize. It doesn't mean it's necessarily bad. What about heat? If honey is diluted in boiling water or tea, heat above 110 degrees Fahrenheit does start to destroy some of the beneficial enzymes and antioxidants, but in general, its other benefits are generally retained, including its antimicrobial properties. With respect to blood sugar, I mentioned that earlier, that some people will use it as a sweetener. Some people think that it won't raise blood sugar at all. Some people think it raises it too much. The truth is kind of in between. If you look at the glycemic index of honey, it's somewhere around 50 to 60 on average, whereas white sugar typically has one around 70 or 80. High fructose corn syrup is also around there. So again, in terms of its effects on the glycemic index, which is the effect on raising insulin levels, it's not as bad as white sugar or high fructose corn syrup, but again, it's not going to be zero either, so do keep that in mind. Some people ask me, is raw honey and natural or regular honey the same? They're technically not the same. Raw honey is ideally unheated, so not heated at all, and completely unfiltered, whereas processed honey can be pasteurized and it can be filtered. Lastly, sometimes patients will ask me about feeding it to babies. It is true that some babies can face a dangerous situation, which is called botulism, due to a microorganism called Clostridium botulinum. So again, it is very rare, typically 1 or 2 cases out of every 100,000 babies or so, but it can theoretically happen. But typically when the infant is over a year old, their digestive system can handle these spores that are produced by this particular microorganism, and so the baby will be able to better tolerate it. These are some common questions that I've come across. Again, I want to reiterate that honey is something that everybody has some knowledge about, but again, hopefully you can start to implement some of these tips and start using it even for other applications. Hope you have benefited. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين.